verified. But notably, that hasn't stopped politicians and Elon Musk from sharing posts about it. With this, as Musk has also tweeted in support of Marsha Blackburn's efforts and letter to the FBI. With of course all of this then adding to the online pressure mounting for Bondi and other officials to follow through and release the files. But for now, we're gonna have to wait to see how all this plays out on several different fronts. But then, next up, it's your daily dose of DOGE. Starting with the fact that things have somehow gotten even messier and more chaotic with Musk's whole "what did you do last week" email to federal employees. We talked about it on the show yesterday. Musk made a post on Saturday saying that all 2.3 million federal workers would be sent an email requesting that they detail what they did last week, with Musk saying failure to respond will be taken as resignation. With then the HR arm of the Office of Personnel Management sending an email asking employees to write 5 bullet points about what they accomplished last week, though notably it said absolutely nothing about Musk's threat regarding failure to respond. With it then just being utter chaos, right? Many of the agencies led by newly installed Trump appointees explicitly told their charges to ignore the email or that the response was voluntary. But then you also had other agencies telling their workers that they had to respond still or strongly encourage them to do so. With then Trump in a press conference yesterday afternoon falsely claiming that the only agencies that weren't complying were the ones that dealt with confidential matters of security like the FBI. With him then adding to the confusion by contradicting what so many of his appointees had told their employees and claimed that the workers who didn't respond to the email would be sort of semi-fired or you're fired. Which I just gotta ask, as an employer, what the fuck is semi-fired? But with it seemingly impossible to get any more confusing, it then somehow did. Right? Because the Washington Post reported yesterday afternoon that OPM, the same agency that sent the first email, told HR leaders of other federal agencies that their employees could ignore the email and they wouldn't lose their jobs. With that reportedly coming from 3 different sources who were familiar with the matter. And specifically, one of those sources told the outlet that this latest directive was given on a call midday yesterday, with a second person briefed on the call adding that OPM wasn't actually sure what to do with the emails of employees who already responded, but claiming the agency had no plans to analyze them. But key thing here, the Post reported that the OPM call actually took place shortly before Trump made his confusing comments about workers getting sort of semi-fired. And later in the day, after our Monday show was up, we saw Musk doubling down on his threat again, writing on X, "Subject to the discretion of the president, they will be given another chance. Failure to respond a second time will result in termination." But then, later that same evening, the OPM published a memo providing guidance on the "what do you do last week" email. And there, the agency said that basically people should respond, but that decision is ultimately up to each agency. Writing, "Agency heads may exclude personnel from this expectation at their discretion and should inform OPM of the categories of the employees excluded and reasons for exclusion." Adding, "It is agency leadership's decision as to what actions are taken against those who don't respond." And so based on the language there, it seems like people will not get fired for not replying unless they work for an agency that decides to require their response. So again, as we talked about yesterday, there are a lot of legal implications that could complicate that. But regardless, what we're seeing here is a situation where you have the OPM, which should be the bottom line, saying one thing to agency leaders while Trump and Musk are saying something totally different to the public. So you have people wondering, are these two just trying to spin this situation to make it look like they're firing more people than they really are, or is this a real threat? And that, in part, because we've seen time and time again how much influence Musk has over Trump and how he actually administers policy. And so that is essentially the update to the email chaos. But then, on the note of Musk potentially trying to spin all of this to make it seem like he's doing more than he actually is, we should also talk about the fact that there have been some massive errors with DOGE's only public accounting of its work. Because over the last week or so, numerous outlets have reported a number of serious flaws with DOGE's so-called wall of receipts, right, which is a new tracker of all the savings the agency is claiming that it's made through staff reductions, lease cancellations, and terminated contracts. And when DOGE first made the tracker live, the website claimed that the agency had saved the federal government $55 billion. And while there's been a lot of media coverage unpacking those claims, one of the most thorough and well-explained pieces came from the New York Times, with us seeing the Times reviewing hundreds of federal contracts and interviewing both experts and the recipients of canceled contracts to reveal that the math behind DOGE's numbers, quote, is marred with accounting errors, incorrect assumptions, outdated data, and other mistakes. Now with this, one thing that I do want to note here is that since the Times published their story, DOGE has since updated the tracker and is now claiming that it has saved the government $65 billion. But it appears that the Times' analysis still stands because it is based on systemic issues with DOGE's accounting that haven't changed and have also been backed up by numerous other reporters and experts. But I wanted to mention that because, one, there has been an update, and two, because their analysis is based on the initial $55 billion figure, which is what we're going to be drawing for the purposes of this story. So with that said, diving into it, right off the bat, arguably one of the biggest overarching issues here is that despite repeated promises of transparency, there's actually no way to account for the vast majority of the $55 billion that DOGE claims to have saved. Or even DOGE itself explicitly says that the 1,125 contracts listed on wall of receipts at the time of this analysis accounted for just 20% of their overall spending cuts, though the Times said that it could not reconcile those numbers. So you have the questions, what's the other 80%? What is the bulk of the money they claim to have cut? And the simple answer is we kind of have no fucking clue. Where DOGE claims that the remaining dollar amounts come from various efforts like fraud deletion, asset sales, workforce reductions, programmatic changes, and more. But but it then also provides zero data or specific estimates on those alleged savings. So you had the Times saying it was not possible to independently verify that number or other totals on the site with the evidence provided. But beyond that, it appears that there are numerous fundamental flaws with the scant 20% that DOGE is actually accounted for. The limited dollar values DOGE has posted for each contract come from data and a central tracking system for government contracts. But there, you had the Times finding some issues with how DOGE was doing its math, something that they actually illustrated really well in one example where DOGE says that it saved $5.4 million by canceling a contract for DEI services for the Department of Homeland Security. Right? And to get that figure, DOGE took the total potential value of the contract, around $7.5 million, and subtracted the $2.1 million that appears to have already been spent. Which, okay, seems simple enough, but this isn't a word question for first graders. We're talking about the incredibly complex system for allocating federal contracts. Literally nothing is simple. And you have experts saying that estimate is likely far too high for a number of reasons. Saying, first of all, data in the federal contracting system could be several months out of date, so this figure could be an undercount of what was already spent. It also doesn't account for the added costs of terminating a contract that the government still has to pay out, like winding down staff, closing offices, ending leases, and offloading equipment. With one expert even saying that leaving out those figures, it makes DOGE's estimates a meaningless metric. And all of this as CBS News also found another type of error regarding DOGE's accounting. Reportedly, the agency triple counted the $655 million maximum value of one contract for USAID with numerous subcontracts. And while DOGE eventually removed two of the duplicate listings, the Times found that it still overestimated the savings on the remaining line item by at least $270 million. But that also was just one of several overestimates. In another example, DOGE claimed that it saved $232 million on an IT contract for the Social Security Administration. But there, you had The Intercept finding that the group actually only canceled a tiny part of the contract that let users mark their gender as X, so the actual savings was just over $500,000. And in addition to stuff like that, there have also been much more obvious errors. Like with when the Wall of Receipts tracker was first rolled out, an $8 million contract for IT services to ICE, it had been mistakenly entered at the value of $8 billion, which would have accounted for almost half of the combined value of all listed contract cuts. And while DOGE did eventually fix the problem, it also made some very misleading claims about the situation on X. So this seeing the agency saying that the discrepancy was a clerical error that their team was aware of, and asserting that DOGE has always used the correct $8 million in its calculations. But then, that post on Musk's own platform, it got community noted, with users pointing out that we literally have receipts that show DOGE's tracker, including the wrong number and then updating it after numerous reports, as well as the fact that DOGE's claimed savings of $55 billion haven't changed despite the fact that multiple line items have been revised after errors were pointed out. Right? And it's not like this is the only reported thing or time that DOGE has made misleading posts about its alleged savings on X. With last week, for example, it retweeting a Treasury Department post saying that the IRS had rescinded a previously planned $1.9 billion contract and done so in connection to the group's work, with DOGE including a screenshot of a $1.9 billion contract with an unnamed vendor that had been marked as terminated. But then, when the Times contacted the vendor in question, they said that their contract had actually been canceled back in the fall, meaning that DOGE was literally taking credit for something that the Biden administration had done. And it doesn't appear that's the only time it's happened, right? Another example, an environmental scientist in Michigan also told the Times that DOGE had included a federal contract that he had in its list of savings, despite the fact that the contract had expired in December. Now, notably, with everything, these are just some of the findings out there by the Times and other outlets, but the last thing that I want to hit on here is another misleading thing that DOGE does with its Wall of Receipts tracker. Because according to NPR, more than a third of the listed contracts posted online would actually not save any money if canceled. That's not some huge secret. DOGE itself literally lists those as saving the government $0. But it appears that they include them so they can say that they canceled a higher amount of contracts even if there's no real impact. And so ultimately you just have this confusing, chaotic, just messy, misleading situation. There's just a million things happening. And all of it is seemingly so ridiculous, they got my man Jon Stewart bleeding at his news desk. Because on the Daily Show last night, you had Jon Stewart adding to the criticism and absolutely ripping into DOGE. With him first arguing that the agency would be better served by going after cuts like $3 billion in federal subsidies to oil and gas companies that already turn billions in profit, as well as $1.3 billion from the carried interest loophole that hedge funds benefit from, right, that allows investment managers to slash their taxable income. And also $2 trillion to defense contractors for the F-35 fighter jet that, in his words, blows, with that being a critique of the jet's numerous setbacks, high costs, and safety concerns.
But see, this is where the real money is. The real money, the money our free market-ish system uses to prop up corporate profit at the expense of the taxpayer. Pharmaceutical companies get everything from our government: tax breaks, research grants, patent extensions, worth billions of dollars. And what do we, the people, get for it? The highest drug prices in the Western Hemisphere.
And then my man Jon Stewart smashed his mug on his desk and accidentally sliced his hand open. With it still bleeding off camera, he concluded that the idea of DOGE, that's not the problem, but arguing that it's how it's going about it, saying,
I want DOGE to work. I want better efficiencies. I want to get rid of